What's going on, APUSH world? We are continuing our presidential series today with the presidency of Richard Milhouse Nixon. He has appeared quite often on the APUSH exam, both in the form of multiple choice questions and essay topics. Most recently in 2011, he appeared on the APUSH exam in the form of a DBQ. So absolutely be familiar with Nixon. Lots of important stuff happened during his administration. So let's start off with some background on Nixon. He made his fame in the political world as being a communist hunter. He was a member of that so important HUAC committee. That is the House of Representatives, not the Senate. Therefore, Joseph McCarthy was not a member of HUAC. He was also the vice president under Dwight D. Eisenhower. And here is Richard Nixon with his children over here. And there is Ike right front and center in the picture. He ran against JFK in the election of 1960, in which he lost, and TV played a very important role in that election. And here is JFK over here to the left, and Richard Nixon to the right. Richard Nixon came across as very uncomfortable on screen, whereas JFK came across very comfortable and very charismatic. Let's jump ahead 8 years to the election of 1968. Nixon is a Republican nominee, and he is running against Herbert Humphrey. And for a while, many people thought it was going to be RFK, JFK's brother, but he was assassinated in 1968. We also have a member of the American Independent Party, George Wallace, is running as a third-party candidate. He was the former governor of Alabama that was in favor of segregation. He disliked protesters, which were very high in number due to the Vietnam War. And George Wallace also advocated or favored the escalation of war in Vietnam. This is a very close popular vote between Nixon and Humphrey, but the electoral vote was lopsided in favor of Nixon. He wins 301 to 191. So let's go to Nixon in Vietnam. Nixon's big policy in Vietnam is Vietnamization. This was his plan to gradually withdraw troops from Vietnam, withdraw U.S. troops, and then turn the power over to the South Vietnamese. So it's replacing American troops with South Vietnamese troops. He appealed to the silent majority. He gives a speech on TV in which he asked for support from the silent majority. This was his belief that most Americans were in fact supportive of the Vietnam War. They just were not protesting like many anti-war protesters were. Henry Kissinger was Nixon's Secretary of State, and here you see him with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, the two Chinese leaders during the 70s. Beginning in the 1960s, but especially in the 1970s, we have bombings of Cambodia, which were authorized by Richard Nixon. Nixon ordered these bombings of neighboring Cambodia. This was a country located right next to Vietnam, and this was a neutral country. And Nixon claimed that the North Vietnamese were using this country, Cambodia, for supply routes. So Nixon believed one way to end the war a little more quickly is to disrupt these supply routes by bombing neighboring neutral Cambodia. You have to absolutely positively know that bombings of Cambodia led directly to the Kent State protests and ultimately the Kent State massacre. This is where students were protesting over the bombing of Cambodia and the Vietnam War, and 4 students were killed by National Guard members during this protest. This is a huge turning point in the Vietnam War, an absolutely enormous one. So let's continue more with Nixon's administration in Vietnam. The Pentagon Papers were issued in 1971. And these were a series of papers that detailed the U.S.'s involvement in Vietnam. And this also showed that there was lots of deceit by JFK and LBJ, their administrations, regarding the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, especially when it comes to that Gulf of Tonkin resolution from 1964. I do have a video on the Vietnam War, so if you want lots more info, check out the description below. Nixon runs for re-election in 1972, and he claims that there is peace at hand in Vietnam. He actually announces this a couple days before the election. And you can see, based on the electoral map above, that he absolutely destroys McGovern in this election. In early 1973, we have the Paris Peace Accords, and this ended the direct U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And there was a ceasefire shortly after. And also part of the agreement, U.S. prisoners would be released within 60 days of the ceasefire. And Nixon claimed to have achieved peace with honor. He really made it well known that, you know what, this is the U.S. leaving. They achieved their peace, but they did so in an honorable way. And that's really up for debate. Many people don't think the U.S. achieved peace with honor because ultimately many people believe the U.S. lost the Vietnam War. All right, let's focus on some foreign policy under Nixon. In February of 1972, February 21st to be exact, and the only reason why I know that is because that is my birthday, Nixon visits China. And as a result of this, U.S. relations with China improved. And Nixon, again, this is groundbreaking news in 1972 because he was this avid communist hunter. He goes to communist China and he's shaking hands with Mao, and the U.S. and Chinese relationships improve. One reason he did this was to kind of put the screws a little bit to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was then concerned over an improved U.S.-Chinese relationship. And this helps lead to something known as détente. And you see Nixon here with Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union. And détente, absolutely know this word. It means easing of Cold War tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. And an example of this, there are many, but an example of this is SALT from 1972, where the Strategic Arms Limitations talks, which leads to the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which is an agreement to limit nuclear weapons between the Soviet Union and the United States. Each side agrees to limit the amount of nukes that they have. Okay, let's go back to the United States home front and focus on domestic issues under Nixon. The EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, is established during his administration, and it is done so to protect the environment, and this organization helps enforce environmental laws and regulations. Nixon also has an increase in Social Security funding during his administration. And one thing that we'll see in the 1970s, and of course during Nixon's administration, is the 1970s are plagued by high inflation. And if you're looking at this inflation chart here, you see really kind of dips low in the 1970s, but then it just starts to skyrocket. So the 70s are plagued with inflation. And this is a result of the high cost of the Vietnam War and also the Great Society from Lyndon B. Johnson. And of course, you can't talk about Nixon's administration without talking about the Watergate scandal. So let's jump ahead to the last few years in office. Well, again, going back to the election of 1972, it is Nixon versus McGovern. Nixon wins in a landslide, 520 to 17. This is the infamous Watergate complex located right here. When you think of Watergate, it is a complex that's made up of hotels, offices, and even some condos. And on June 17th, 1972, so about 5 months before the election, 5 men broke into the Democratic headquarters in the Watergate complex. Turns out, after some investigation, these 5 men had ties to the Nixon administration, and it goes all the way back to Nixon having knowledge of the break-in and actually having a role in it. So this is what people are talking about when they talk about the Watergate scandal. People were hired by Nixon's administration with Nixon's consent to break into the Democratic headquarters to spy on McGovern's campaign, which is really stupid because you can see how badly Nixon won. He was just a very paranoid man. In 1973, we have the War Powers Act, which overturned the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and this limited the president's involvement in wars. The president had to notify Congress within 48 hours of taking war actions, and also troops could not be used longer than 60 days unless Congress extended it. Let's flash forward to August 9th, 1974. As a result of the Watergate scandal, Nixon resigns, and he is shortly after pardoned by the new president, Gerald Ford, who was the only president in United States history to not be elected president or vice president. He was appointed after Nixon's old vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned. All right, some test tips for you on the presidency of Richard Nixon. If it's multiple choice topics, definitely be familiar with the War Powers Act. And also, I didn't mention this in the video, but be familiar with the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, was influenced by Rachel Carson. She's an author, and she wrote a book called Silent Spring. And this book talked about the harmful effects of pesticides and other things on the environment. If it's an essay topic, you could be expected to focus on the domestic and foreign issues under Nixon, and also how does he respond to these, and was his response effective or not. And most importantly, good luck on any and all exams you take, especially the one in May. All right, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope I was able to clarify lots of information about the presidency of Richard Nixon. If you have not already, please take a moment and subscribe to my channel. Help me spread the word. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the section below. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day, guys.